It began with a discovery that was never supposed to leave the palace archives. Hidden among decades of sealed correspondence was a collection of letters believed to be among Princess Diana's final personal writings. For years, whispers surrounded their disappearance. But when Princess Catherine reportedly uncovered evidence pointing toward Queen Camilla's involvement in keeping those letters buried, a quiet royal mystery exploded into a crisis that now threatens to shake the foundations of the monarchy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For decades, the story of Diana's final years has remained one of the most emotionally charged chapters in royal history. Questions lingered. Rumors refused to disappear. Yet whenever those questions surfaced, they seemed to encounter an invisible wall of silence. According to growing whispers from palace circles, that wall may finally be cracking. Reports suggest that Catherine recently gained access to a collection of previously restricted archive materials, records that had remained untouched by most senior royals for years. What began as a routine review of historical documents allegedly transformed into something far more unsettling when references emerged to a group of letters that many believed had vanished long ago. At first, the discovery appeared insignificant. A missing reference here, an incomplete notation there, but the deeper Catherine reportedly examined the records, the more troubling the inconsistencies became. Certain files appeared incomplete. Dates did not align. Correspondence logs referenced materials that were nowhere to be found. Palace insiders claimed that questions soon began circulating about who had authority over the documents and, more importantly, who may have benefited from keeping them hidden. What should have been a straightforward historical review was suddenly turning into an investigation that reached into some of the most sensitive corners of royal history. Sources close to the household suggest Catherine became increasingly disturbed as the pattern emerged. This was not merely about forgotten paperwork. These letters were believed to contain some of Diana's final private reflections, written during a period when her relationship with the institution was under immense strain. If those writings had indeed been withheld from official records, someone had allegedly made a conscious decision years ago to keep them from public view. The implications were enormous, not only for Diana's legacy, but for the reputation of those who may have played a role in suppressing her voice. As concern grew, William was reportedly briefed on the findings in private. Those familiar with the situation claimed the future king reacted with deep concern. For him, the matter was intensely personal. Diana was not simply a historical figure preserved in archives and documentaries. She was his mother. Every unanswered question carried emotional weight, and every new revelation threatened to reopen wounds that had never fully healed. Meanwhile, whispers of an approaching bombshell spread quietly among senior staff. Advisors allegedly began discussing the issue behind closed doors, while longtime palace figures feared that a major confrontation could be unavoidable if further evidence emerged. What nobody realized at the time was that this discovery would become the first thread in a much larger tapestry of secrets, one that stretched back decades and reached far beyond a handful of missing documents. Because every answer seemed to uncover two new questions, and every document appeared connected to decisions made long ago by powerful figures determined to shape how history would remember Diana. But uncovering the letters was only the beginning, because the deeper Catherine looked, the more she found evidence of a decades-long effort to keep certain truths hidden. Royal archives are designed to preserve history, not erase it. Yet certain files connected to Diana appeared strangely incomplete, as though someone had carefully removed pieces of a much larger story. The missing pages raised a troubling question. What was so important that powerful figures allegedly felt the need to keep it buried for years? The discovery that had unsettled Catherine refused to fade into the background. Instead, it grew larger with every document she reviewed and every unanswered question she encountered. What had begun as a search for a handful of missing letters was slowly transforming into something far more disturbing. Reports suggest that Catherine spent weeks examining archived correspondence linked to Diana's final years, determined to understand how such significant materials could seemingly vanish from official records. At first, the inconsistencies appeared isolated, little more than administrative oversights, buried beneath decades of paperwork. But as the review continued, a pattern allegedly began to emerge. References pointed toward documents that no longer existed. Letters mentioned attachments that were nowhere to be found. Entire chains of correspondence appeared to stop abruptly, as though someone had deliberately severed the story before it could be completed. The deeper Catherine reportedly looked, the more uneasy the atmosphere became. Palace insiders claim that several records contained unexplained gaps that defied ordinary explanation. Dates were missing. Filing references led nowhere. Notations hinted at materials that should have been preserved but had somehow disappeared. What made the situation particularly alarming was that these gaps all seemed connected to the same sensitive period in Diana's life. It was almost as if fragments of history had been carefully extracted, leaving behind enough information to suggest their existence, but not enough to reveal what they actually contained. That realization transformed a historical inquiry into a potential royal scandal. As concerns spread, attention reportedly turned toward individuals who had worked closest to Diana during her final years. Former aides who had long faded from public discussion suddenly became subjects of renewed interest. Some had retired from royal life decades earlier. Others had rarely spoken publicly about their experiences. Yet according to Palace Whispers, investigators began quietly examining who had access to certain documents, and who may have been involved in decisions surrounding their storage and preservation. Every new lead seemed to raise additional questions. Some accounts conflicted with official records. Others appeared to support suspicions that key information had been handled differently from standard royal procedures. Meanwhile, a far more sensitive question was beginning to surface behind closed doors. Who actually had authority over these documents? Who possessed the power to determine which materials remained preserved and which disappeared from view? According to insiders, that question triggered intense private discussions among palace historians and archival experts. Individuals familiar with royal record-keeping reportedly became increasingly concerned by what they described as unusual alterations within historical collections. While no definitive answers emerged, the very existence of those concerns added fuel to an already growing fire. For William, the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. Sources suggest that he was receiving regular updates as more information came to light. What disturbed him most was not merely the possibility that records had been altered. It was the thought that pieces of his mother's story may have been deliberately withheld for years. The future king reportedly began demanding a comprehensive review of all related files, determined to understand who had made these decisions and why. What started as a quiet investigation was now evolving into a search for accountability, one that threatened to expose long-buried tensions within the royal household itself. Yet even as investigators continued examining forgotten records and interviewing figures from the past, a more troubling possibility was beginning to take shape. The evidence increasingly suggested that responsibility might extend beyond retired staff, members, or administrative mistakes. Somewhere within the growing maze of missing documents, altered files, and unanswered questions, there appeared to be a connection pointing towards someone far more powerful, someone whose name had remained absent from the conversation until now. As investigators reportedly retraced the paper trail, attention slowly shifted away from forgotten staff members and toward a much more controversial figure. The letters were said to contain more than personal reflections. According to whispers circulating among royal circles, they may have included Diana's deepest concerns about the future of the monarchy, her sons, and the people who would eventually occupy positions of influence after her death. As attention shifted toward the contents of the missing correspondence, the investigation entered an even more sensitive phase. Until now, the mystery had focused largely on what had disappeared and who may have controlled access to it. But reports suggest that those who reviewed references to the letters became increasingly convinced that the documents themselves carried extraordinary significance. According to Palace Whispers, These were not ordinary personal notes, written during quiet moments of reflection. They were believed to contain observations, concerns, and deeply private thoughts from a woman who had spent years navigating the pressures, expectations, and internal realities of royal life. If true, the letters represented far more than historical artifacts. They represented Diana's final voice, reaching across decades, carrying warnings and concerns that some believe were never meant to vanish. Sources familiar with the growing controversy claim that several references pointed toward sensitive personal observations regarding the future direction of the monarchy. Diana had always occupied a unique position within the institution. She understood its strengths, but she had also experienced its struggles firsthand. According to speculation surrounding the missing documents, she may have reflected on what kind of future awaited the royal family after her death, and what challenges the next generation would face as they inherited responsibilities larger than themselves. These alleged concerns immediately captured attention because they appeared strikingly relevant to the modern monarchy, particularly during a period when public trust, family divisions, and questions about leadership continue to dominate headlines. What reportedly drew the greatest interest were suggestions that some of the letters contained references to William and the role he would one day assume. Palace insiders claim that discussions surrounding the documents increasingly centered on passages believed to address his future responsibilities as king. Whether those references were expressions of hope, concern, guidance, or caution remains unclear. Yet the mere possibility that Diana had left behind personal thoughts regarding her eldest son's destiny transformed the letters into something emotionally powerful. They were no longer viewed simply as missing historical records. They became symbols of an unfinished conversation between a mother and the future monarch she would never see crowned. For Catherine, the growing revelations reportedly carried a deeply personal impact. According to those familiar with the situation, the more she learned about the letters, the more emotionally invested she became in uncovering the truth. Catherine has long been associated with preserving aspects of Diana's legacy, and the possibility that important parts of that legacy had remained hidden reportedly affected her profoundly. Sources suggest she began viewing the search not merely as an archival investigation, but as a responsibility to ensure that history was preserved honestly and completely. The emotional weight of that realization allegedly strengthened her determination to continue pushing forward, despite increasing resistance and mounting controversy. Outside palace walls, speculation intensified rapidly. Royal commentators began debating the historical significance of the letters and what they might reveal if their contents ever became fully known. Some argued that they could reshape public understanding of Diana's final years. Others believed they might offer remarkable insight into her hopes for the monarchy's future. As fragments of information continued leaking into public discussion, fascination grew. The mystery expanded beyond royal insiders and historians, becoming a story that captured widespread attention. Every rumor generated fresh questions. Every unanswered question deepened the intrigue. Yet beneath the growing fascination with Diana's words, another possibility was quietly emerging, one far more explosive than anything contained within the letters themselves. Because as investigators continued examining records and tracing decisions made years earlier, some insiders allegedly became less focused on what Diana had written and more concerned about who may have feared those writings becoming public in the first place. Yet the real shock came not from what Diana may have written, but from who some insiders believed worked hardest to ensure those words never surfaced. What started as scattered inconsistencies soon formed a pattern. Piece by piece, Catherine reportedly connected records, timelines, and decisions that appeared too coordinated to be mere coincidence. The emerging picture pointed toward a campaign of silence that stretched across years. The investigation had now reached a point where simple explanations no longer seemed sufficient. Missing documents could be dismissed as administrative errors. Incomplete records could be blamed on time, oversight, or poor organization. But according to growing whispers inside royal circles, The evidence Catherine was reviewing appeared increasingly difficult to explain away. Every missing page seemed connected to another missing page. Every unanswered question appeared tied to a decision made years earlier. What had once looked like isolated anomalies were beginning to resemble pieces of a much larger puzzle, one that someone had allegedly spent considerable effort trying to keep hidden from public view. Reports suggest Catherine began comparing archive records against internal correspondence from the same periods. It was a painstaking process, one that required patience and attention to details many others might have overlooked. Yet as she reportedly moved through decades of material, an unsettling trend allegedly became impossible to ignore. References found in private communications often failed to match what appeared in official archives. Letters discussed meetings that seemed absent from formal records. Memoranda referenced documents that could no longer be located. Entire sequences of correspondence appeared interrupted at crucial moments. The more comparisons that were made, the more the gaps appeared deliberate rather than accidental. According to palace insiders, the breakthrough came when multiple timelines allegedly began, intersecting around several key decisions. Events that had once seemed unrelated suddenly appeared connected by a common thread. Dates surrounding archival changes reportedly aligned with moments of major transition. Within the royal family, certain documents disappeared shortly after sensitive developments. Others were allegedly restricted during periods when public interest in Diana remained particularly intense. On their own, each instance might have been dismissed. Together, they painted a picture that raised uncomfortable questions about whether historical records had been managed in ways that served interests beyond simple preservation. As those questions intensified, attention increasingly turned toward the role of influence. Who had the authority to shape these decisions? Who possessed enough standing within royal circles to affect the handling of sensitive materials? According to reports circulating among senior staff, discussions began focusing on periods during which Camilla's position within the royal household had steadily expanded. No definitive conclusions emerged, but insiders claim that investigators became interested in understanding whether influence, rather than official responsibility, may have played a role in key moments connected to the missing records. That possibility alone was enough to create growing anxiety throughout palace corridors. The atmosphere reportedly became noticeably tense. Staff members who had previously viewed the inquiry as a routine historical review now understood that it was evolving into something far more consequential. According to palace whispers, some employees grew increasingly nervous about where the investigation might lead. Others feared that long-buried decisions could soon face renewed scrutiny. Every new discovery seemed to widen the circle of people potentially connected to the mystery, creating a sense that the story was moving steadily toward a confrontation nobody could fully predict. Meanwhile, William continued receiving updated findings from trusted advisors. Sources suggest each briefing added new layers to his concern. What disturbed him was not only the possibility that important records had been withheld, but the growing belief that this may have happened over an extended period of time. For a future king, committed to protecting both history and public trust, the implications were enormous. Discussions reportedly began taking place regarding accountability, transparency, and whether a broader review of sensitive royal archives might become necessary. Questions that once belonged solely to historians were now becoming matters of institutional credibility. Yet as Catherine remained focused on carefully assembling the truth from fragments scattered across decades, William's thinking was beginning to move in a different direction. While she concentrated on understanding what had happened, he reportedly became increasingly determined to discover who should answer for it. And as pressure mounted behind palace walls, it became clear that the next phase of this unfolding drama would not center on missing records alone, it would center on responsibility. But while Catherine focused on uncovering the truth, William was preparing for something far more direct. For William, this was never simply about documents. It was about his mother's voice. If someone had truly played a role in suppressing Diana's final words, then years of unanswered questions suddenly demanded resolution. and William was reportedly unwilling to let the matter rest. By this stage, the controversy had moved far beyond missing files and archival discrepancies. What had begun as Catherine's quiet effort to understand inconsistencies in historical records was rapidly evolving into something much larger, something far more personal. According to sources close to the royal household, William no longer viewed the investigation as a matter of administrative oversight. To him, every missing document represented another unanswered question about Diana's legacy. Every unexplained alteration carried the possibility that important pieces of his mother's story had been hidden from both history and her own family. That belief reportedly transformed his concern into determination. Insiders claim that William soon began pushing for a comprehensive internal review. 1. Designed to examine not only the missing letters, but the broader chain of decisions surrounding them. This was no longer about discovering whether documents had disappeared. It was about understanding how such a situation had been allowed to develop in the first place. According to palace whispers, discussions intensified behind closed doors as senior figures realized that the future king was demanding clarity on issues many had long considered settled. Questions that once circulated quietly among historians were now being raised at the highest levels of the institution itself. Reports suggest that trusted advisors were summoned for a series of private consultations as William sought a complete picture of the situation. Individuals familiar with archival procedures, historical record-keeping, and past administrative decisions allegedly found themselves facing renewed scrutiny. The atmosphere reportedly grew increasingly tense with each new meeting. For years, many within the royal household believed the mystery surrounding Diana's missing correspondence would remain buried within the archives. Now, that assumption appeared to be collapsing under the weight of growing pressure. As the review expanded, those connected to key archival decisions reportedly began facing difficult questions. While no formal accusations emerged, insiders claim that attention increasingly focused on understanding who had been involved in determining access, preservation, and classification of sensitive materials. Every answer seemed to create another layer of complexity. Every explanation appeared to reveal new inconsistencies. What made the situation particularly explosive was that the investigation no longer centered solely on historical records. It was beginning to touch on trust, accountability, and the credibility of decisions made over many years. The strain reportedly exposed divisions that had long existed beneath the surface of royal life. According to palace sources, differing opinions emerged regarding how aggressively the matter should be pursued. Some believed the institution needed complete transparency, regardless of the consequences. Others feared that reopening old controversies could create new instability. Those disagreements allegedly became increasingly difficult to ignore as the investigation gained momentum. The search for answers was no longer uniting the household. In some respects, it was revealing just how differently various members viewed the past. Throughout the growing storm, Catherine reportedly remained firmly at William's side. Sources suggest her commitment to uncovering the truth never wavered, even as resistance and pressure increased. What had started as her discovery had now become a shared mission. Together, they were reportedly determined to ensure that Diana's legacy was understood through facts rather than omissions. That resolve only strengthened as public interest exploded beyond palace walls. Outside the royal household, speculation reached extraordinary levels. Commentators, historians, and media outlets began discussing the mystery with renewed intensity. Every leaked detail generated fresh debate. Every rumor sparked new theories. The public fascination with Diana's legacy, already powerful decades after her death, suddenly surged once again. What had once been a private investigation was rapidly becoming a national conversation, and as more people began asking questions, the pressure on those connected to the controversy grew heavier by the day. Yet the greatest challenge was still ahead, because while William continued demanding answers within the palace, the story was beginning to escape the control of those who had managed it for years. What happened next would ensure that the controversy could no longer remain confined to private meetings and confidential reviews. As demands for answers intensified behind palace walls, the controversy began spilling into the public eye. The monarchy has weathered countless storms, but few controversies strike deeper than questions involving Diana's legacy. With public attention growing and rumors multiplying, palace officials reportedly faced mounting pressure to explain how such significant documents remained hidden for so long. What had started as a private investigation was no longer confined to palace corridors. The story had escaped into the wider world, and once it did, its momentum became almost impossible to control. Every new rumor, every whispered revelation, and every fragment of leaked information seemed to ignite another wave of speculation. For decades, Diana had remained one of the most beloved and influential figures associated with the royal family. Her legacy endured not because of titles or ceremonies, but because millions of people felt personally connected to her story. That emotional connection was now fueling a global fascination with the mystery surrounding the missing letters. Suddenly, the question was no longer whether the documents existed. The question had become why they had allegedly remained hidden for so many years. Across media platforms and public discussions, commentators began debating the significance of the controversy. Some viewed it as a historical mystery, deserving answers. Others saw it as part of a much larger conversation about transparency within institutions, built upon tradition and secrecy. According to reports, royal historians and longtime observers increasingly focused their attention on the handling of sensitive records. If important correspondence connected to Diana had indeed been withheld, what did that reveal about the systems designed to preserve royal history? The debate expanded beyond the letters themselves and evolved into something much broader, a discussion about trust, accountability, and the responsibility of those entrusted with safeguarding the past. Inside the palace, the pressure reportedly intensified with every passing day. Communications teams allegedly found themselves facing a challenge unlike any they had encountered in years. Ordinarily, speculation could be managed through silence, careful messaging, or the simple passage of time. But this controversy was different. 1. Diana's enduring popularity meant public interest only grew stronger as questions multiplied. Every attempt to contain the story seemed to generate even greater curiosity. Every unanswered question encouraged fresh theories. What made the situation particularly difficult was that no official explanation appeared, capable of satisfying the growing demand for clarity. Meanwhile, Catherine's role in the unfolding drama continued to expand. According to insiders, many observers now viewed her as the central figure responsible for bringing the mystery into the open. What had begun as her review of historical records had transformed into a search for answers that resonated far beyond palace walls. Supporters praised her determination. Critics questioned the consequences of reopening old wounds. Yet regardless of perspective, one reality had become impossible to ignore. Without Catherine's persistence, the questions surrounding Diana's missing correspondence may never have resurfaced at all. Alongside Catherine's growing prominence stood William's unwavering resolve. Reports suggest that public awareness of his involvement only strengthened interest in the story. To many, his determination represented something deeply personal. This was not merely a future king examining historical records. This was a son seeking answers connected to his mother's legacy. That emotional dimension gave the controversy extraordinary weight. People were not simply following a royal dispute, they were witnessing a struggle rooted in memory, loyalty, and the desire to understand what had happened years earlier. As the pressure mounted, the atmosphere surrounding the investigation became increasingly charged. Palace officials reportedly understood that every development carried the potential to reshape public perceptions. Historians waited for new information. Commentators searched for clues. The public watched closely. Yet despite all the attention focused on missing documents, archival decisions, and growing demands for accountability, an even more explosive possibility remained just beyond the horizon. Because if the letters truly existed, and if they contained the thoughts many believed they contained, then the controversy was still only in its early stages. The search for the documents had created one crisis. Their contents could create an entirely different one. And as anticipation continued building, a question lingered over everything that had happened so far, a question capable of changing the entire story. Yet the greatest challenge still remained, the possibility that the full contents of Diana's letters could eventually become known. At its core, this was no longer a dispute about archives. It had become a battle over Diana's legacy, her memory, and the future identity of the royal family itself. Every revelation seemed to deepen the divide between competing visions of what the monarchy should represent. As the controversy continued expanding, the focus gradually shifted away from missing and towards something far more profound. The letters had become symbols. The investigation had become a mirror, and reflected within that mirror were questions that reached to the very heart of the monarchy itself. What kind of institution would the royal family be moving forward? One built upon openness and accountability, or one still shaped by silence and carefully protected secrets? These questions resonated far beyond palace walls, because they touched upon something millions of people had wondered for years. Diana's story had never truly ended. Her influence remained woven into the identity of the modern monarchy, and now, decades later, her legacy once again stood at the center of a defining struggle. According to observers following the unfolding drama, Diana's enduring presence became the theme connecting every part of the controversy. Long after her passing, she continued to inspire extraordinary loyalty from people around the world. Her compassion, her humanity, and her ability to connect with ordinary people remained powerful elements of her public image. That emotional connection helped explain why the mystery surrounding the letters had generated such intense interest. The public was not simply searching for hidden documents. Many believed they were searching for a deeper understanding of Diana herself. Every development seemed to reinforce the idea that her voice still carried influence, even years after it had supposedly been silenced. Amid this growing attention, Catherine increasingly found herself compared to Diana by supporters who viewed both women as figures capable of reshaping public perceptions of the monarchy. According to palace insiders, those comparisons became more frequent as Catherine continued pushing for answers. While the situations were vastly different, many observers saw similarities in their commitment to authenticity and their willingness to confront difficult realities. The comparisons reportedly brought both admiration and pressure. Catherine was not trying to become another Diana. Yet as the investigation progressed, she found herself occupying a role that many believed echoed aspects of Diana's lasting impact on royal life. For William, however, the issue remained deeply personal. Sources suggest that he viewed the search for truth as an obligation rather than a choice. Protecting historical accuracy was important, but preserving his mother's legacy carried an emotional weight unlike anything else. According to those close to the situation, William became increasingly convinced that unanswered questions could no longer remain unanswered. Every missing piece of information represented a gap in the story of someone whose influence that shaped both his life and the future of the monarchy. That conviction reportedly strengthened his resolve, even as resistance and uncertainty continued growing around him. Yet the deeper the investigation went, the more questions emerged about trust within the royal household itself. Palace whispers suggested that differing opinions were becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. Some believed transparency was essential regardless of the consequences. Others feared that continued scrutiny could deepen divisions and reopen old wounds. According to reports, senior royals quietly began forming their own perspectives on the controversy. Conversations allegedly took place behind closed doors, away from public attention, as individuals weighed loyalty against accountability. While no open confrontation emerged, many sensed that invisible lines were being drawn throughout the institution. Those divisions created a growing sense of uncertainty about the future. Relationships that once appeared stable now seemed vulnerable to strain. Alliances that had existed for years faced new pressures. Every revelation carried the potential to alter how family members viewed one another. Every unanswered question threatened to deepen existing tensions. The investigation was no longer just about the past. It was beginning to shape the future, and that future remained clouded by one enormous uncertainty: Because despite all the speculation, despite all the debates, despite all the pressure building within the palace and beyond it, the central mystery remained unresolved. The letters themselves still held secrets. Their full contents remained unknown, and somewhere within those missing pages might lie the answer to everything. And as tensions reached their highest point, one final question remained unanswered. Some secrets survive for years, others survive for decades, but history has a way of resurfacing when least expected. The mystery surrounding Diana's final letters may have remained hidden for a generation, yet the determination to uncover the truth proved stronger than silence itself. As the controversy reached its most intense stage, one reality became impossible to ignore. The story had grown beyond missing documents, beyond private investigations, and beyond the walls of the royal household. What began as a search for answers had evolved into something far larger, a battle over memory, accountability, and the enduring power of a legacy that refused to fade. The unanswered questions surrounding Diana's final letters had forced people to confront difficult possibilities, revisit painful chapters, and reconsider long-held assumptions about what had truly happened behind closed doors. Yet despite the uncertainty, one thing was becoming increasingly clear: the effort to uncover the truth had already changed the conversation forever. At the center of that transformation stood Catherine. According to many observers, her decision to pursue inconsistencies within the archives became one of the defining moments of the entire saga. What started as a review of historical records reportedly developed into an investigation that reignited global interest in one of the most significant figures in modern royal history. Catherine did not set out to create a public controversy, yet through persistence and determination, she allegedly exposed questions that others had overlooked, avoided, or quietly accepted for years. In doing so, she became a central figure in a story that stretched across generations and touched millions of people who still felt connected to Diana's memory. For William, however, the journey remained unfinished. Sources suggest that his pursuit of clarity continued even as public attention intensified. The mystery surrounding the letters was never simply a historical puzzle to solve. It was tied to something far more personal. It was connected to the memory of a mother, whose influence still shaped his life and the future role he would one day inherit. Every new discovery seemed to reinforce his belief that unanswered questions deserved answers, regardless of how much time had passed. That determination reportedly remained unshaken, even as the controversy generated fresh challenges and growing scrutiny. Meanwhile, Diana's legacy continued to dominate public discussion. Decades after her death, her ability to inspire emotion, loyalty, and fascination remained extraordinary. The letters themselves became symbols of something larger than their physical existence. They represented unfinished chapters, unheard perspectives, and a voice many believed still deserved to be heard. As debates intensified, people around the world found themselves returning once again to questions surrounding Diana's life, her experiences, and the impact she left behind. In many ways, the mystery surrounding the letters reminded everyone that her story had never truly ended. Yet with renewed attention came renewed scrutiny. Questions about accountability persisted. Observers continued asking who knew what, who made key decisions, and whether important historical records had been handled appropriately. While definitive answers remained elusive, the pressure for transparency showed no signs of disappearing. The controversy had exposed vulnerabilities, reignited old debates, and challenged assumptions that had remained largely unexamined for years. Regardless of where the investigation ultimately led, it had already forced difficult conversations that could no longer be ignored. The monarchy itself now faced the challenge of responding to those questions while preserving public trust. Historical decisions once considered settled were being viewed through an entirely different lens. Actions taken years earlier were being reassessed. Motivations were being reconsidered. The institution found itself navigating a delicate balance between protecting its traditions and addressing growing demands for openness. It was a challenge made even more difficult by the emotional weight attached to Diana's memory and the enduring public desire to understand the truth. In the end, perhaps that is what made this story so powerful. It was never truly about a collection of letters. It was about the search for understanding. It was about the belief that history matters, that unanswered questions matter, and that truth retains its importance no matter how many years pass. The investigation became larger than any single royal figure because it touched on universal themes of memory, justice, loyalty, and legacy. And while many mysteries remain unresolved, one lesson emerged above all others. Silence can delay the truth, but it rarely defeats it forever. Because while documents can be hidden, archives can be sealed, and voices can be suppressed, the legacy of Princess Diana continues to echo through the corridors of the monarchy, and that echo may be impossible to silence forever. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.